Yeah. Yes, with the pen. That's the real one. Whenever you make it a thing, you have to wipe it out and wipe it out. Many years ago. There's definitely where have we okay? And then corrected. Yeah, well, no, I think
I like that idea. Yeah.
so you have you have the
All right, welcome back. And so we continue with our exciting program this afternoon. And the next presentation is going to be by Dr. Dylan Esler, who is a Tibetan Buddhist scholar and translator who got his PhD from the Université Catholique de Louvain. And he also has an MA from SOAS from London. His research centers on early Nyingma expositions of Dzogchen and Tantra. And he's currently a researcher on a larger project sponsored by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And so please welcome Dr. Esler.
So thank you very much, Ingrid Galambos, and all the organizers for this kind invitation to participate in this fascinating workshop. So my paper today focuses on the use of visualization practices in the tantric writings of the Tibetan master Nubchen Sangye Yeshe. He lived from around 844 to mid-10th century. And he is one of the earliest exegetes to have codified the emergent Dzogchen tradition as a separate vehicle distinct from Mahāyoga. Reference will also be made in this paper to the Kundurik Do, or the Sutra of All-Embracing Awareness, which is considered to be the root tantra of Anuyoga, as this text belongs to a transitional moment between Mahāyoga and Dzogchen, and is also one of Nubchen Sangye Yeshe's important sources. So my paper explores in particular how such visualization practices and their absence are mobilized in Nubchen Sangye Yeshe's writings as a marker of difference between the two contemplative approaches of Mahāyoga and Dzogchen. So first of all, we will look at some of the terms that designate visualization in our Tibetan sources. Then we will examine several examples of visualization techniques described in these sources in the context mainly of Mahāyoga tantric practice, and see how typically they are used to effect a transition towards a state of non-imaging. And this will pave the way for us to appreciate the type of tantric demarcation that Nubchen Sangye Yeshe has in mind when he defines Dzogchen as being free from visualization style practices. So there are a number of terms that refer to visualization in the Tibetan tantric texts. The most explicit in this regard are hipa, which corresponds to the Sanskrit utpat, and which can be translated as to generate or to develop, and signifies both the generation of a thought or affect, for example, the memory of one's parents in order to generate compassion and then to extend these feelings towards all beings. The generation, of course, of the bodhicitta, the enlightened mind, and the generation of the deity's body through visualization. Now, in this latter sense, it comes to be classified as the generation phase, kirib, utpatikrama. Secondly, we have the verb saldep, which corresponds most closely to the idea of visualization in the more narrow sense of achieving a clear mental picture of something. And indeed, the term is often abbreviated simply to sal or salwa, a word which on its own means clarity, as if to emphasize the clarity of the visualized image. And thirdly, we have mikpa, which corresponds to the Sanskrit alambana and has the wider sense of any form of thinking that involves a referential object, that is the mental representation of an object. So depending on the context, I translate this as imaged reference, referential imaging, or imagination. So what's important to note is that the term has a wider semantic range than saldep, visualization, and also that it needs to be clearly distinguished from the notion of an object as a given fact of experience. In his Abhidharmakosha, Vasubandhu is careful, for instance, to distinguish the term object, vishaya, and imaged reference, alambana, whereas the former is the domain where the sense faculties exercise their function. The latter is the reference point, grasped by the mind and the mental events. So in terms of Buddhist perceptual theory, the mind and mental events have both the object and the imaged reference. On the other hand, the sense faculties, such as the eye, ear, etc., only have an object. Hence, referential imaging refers to the mental representation of such an object. There are also other Tibetan terms that can, aside from their main meaning, connote various forms of visual imaging, such as sempa, a verb which means to think, and which often occurs in the future tense sampa. Then we have mopa, which usually signifies belief or predilection and corresponds to the Sanskrit adimoksha, but sometimes also means to envisage. And then we have tokpa, which can correspond to vitarka, examining, but also to samkalpa, conception and discursiveness. But we need to say that none of these terms have the same technical weight as the ones that I mentioned previously. So from one perspective, the purpose of visualization practices in Buddhist meditation is to keep the mind settled and hence to achieve the aim of calming meditation or calm abiding, shamatha. This is how visualization of the figure of the magnificent golden Buddha is taught in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, which Nubchen Sangye Yeshe assimilates in his lamp with the eye of contemplation to the gradual approach. Now, quoting Baba Viveka, the example given is of a wild elephant being gradually tamed by tying it with the rope of recollection to the firm pillar of referential imaging, the Mahout controlling it with the goad of acumen or prajna. So we have in this example three things that come together. We have referential imaging, the referential object to which the mind is tied, recollection, smriti, which is the process by which the mind is kept focused on the object and brought back to the object whenever it wanders off. And thirdly, we have acumen or discernment, which is that by which the force of the afflictions is broken. So it's in exactly the same terms that the practice of visualization is framed in the tantric context of Mahāyoga, with its purpose being explicitly said to stabilize the mind, particularly for practitioners of lesser faculties. So after having taken his seat on a clean cushion, the meditator is invited to imagine the syllables Om, Ah, and Hum in white, azure, and red color at the center of his heart. And he thereupon imagines that light rays emanate from these syllables, purifying the entire universe and its inhabitants. After this exercise, he is to remain in a state of non-referentiality or non-imaging, seeing all phenomena as unborn awareness and thereby realizing non-duality. So visualization practices are also used as a way to envision the network of channels and nexuses making up the subtle body and the manipulation of seminal nuclei and lights that are supposed to flow through these channels. The practice, which combines visualization with psychophysical processes, is described as milking the celestial cow in allusion to the downward flow of ambrosia from the cranial nexus. The details of the practice, however, are passed over in silence, as we can assume that they were supposed to be passed on through oral transmission. A further set of visualization practices is provided by Nubchen Sangye Yeshe in the Mahāyoga context in order to train for the moment of death. So in the heart, in the what is called the inner casket of wisdom, the yogin should imagine that his afflicted mental consciousness, the Krishna Mano Vijnana, is a moon disk, and upon this moon disk is the repository consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana, which is visualized as a sun disk. And upon the sun disk, we have a white syllable hum, which symbolizes wisdom. So while this is not specified in so many words, the point of the visualization seems to be to integrate the ordinary afflicted versions of consciousness into their underlying pure essence of wisdom. So after having meditated in this way for some time, the images are allowed to dissolve again into non-imaging. An alternative form of the practice consists in coordinating the visualization of the dissolution of each of these elements with the breath, so that each time one exhales and inhales, one of these elements dissolves into the other. So the dissolution happens upwards. So the moon disk dissolves into the sun disk, and the sun disk dissolves into the syllable hum, which in turn evaporates into the Chandrabindu. The hum then transforms into a wrathful deity called Heruka, and this wrathful deity finally dissolves into a phalanx of light, whereupon the meditator should rest in non-imaging without doing anything in particular. So we can see that this relatively simple visualization exercise is used as a way to access non-imaging, but also to purify the conditioned and contaminated aspects of consciousness, absorbing them into their pure counterpart, wisdom, as a way to prepare for the moment of death. Somewhat surprisingly, perhaps, we also find such a visualization in the chapter on Dzogchen, again presented as a way to prepare for the moment of death. So here the passage is fairly cryptic, yet the gist of it is that the practitioner must focus on the seminal nucleus at the center of the heart, and there plant the mind's vitality while freely ambling about in the open dimension of the Dharmadhatu. So the passage further elaborates how the principle of vitality rides upon the stallion of the breath. It is then raised by meditating on the syllables A and Ya, and is made to expand into the expanse of Akanishta, transcending birth and death, as well as hope and fear. So the overall goal of visualization is compared to pouring molten gold over a statue so that the whole of appearance becomes luminously clear, or becomes imbued with the luminous clarity of the nature of mind. So several points stand out in this visualization. There is a certain creative tension between focusing on a point at the center of the practitioner's being, probably in the heart, but the text does not say so explicitly. The text says at the center of 3 secret treasuries. And on the other hand, a sense of expansiveness ambling about in the open dimension of the 3 peaks. And then there's also a close connection between the principle of vitality and the breath. The ultimate purpose of the practice seems to be to send off the vitality principle with the breath into the expanse of the seminal nucleus of Akanishta. And here Akanishta is understood not as the apex of the realm of form, but rather in its tantric sense of being a Sambhogakaya pure field. And so this whole visualization is given as a manner of pre-enacting and preparing for the moment of passing away. So it's important to note that in these practices, the ultimate purpose of the visualization is to culminate in a state of non-imaging. As the Sutra of All-Embracing Awareness, the Kundarik Do, reminds us, the enlightened mind itself is non-referential. And it is by attuning to the principle of non-imaging that the mirror of the mind can be clarified, so that the sky-like nature of the Dharmata, of reality as such, can be made present. And from this perspective, meditating on various forms is considered to be a childish activity, which is compared to children drawing forms in the sand. And the idea is that all the forms that will be created in this way cannot be anything else than the artificial projections of the practitioner's mind. So what is important then is to stop referential imaging rather than to entertain it. So the scripture, the Kundarik Do, goes on to explain that true meditation is not something that can be meditated on, it being without the referential activity of grasping at an object. But the question then is, how do visualization and referential imaging relate to and enable non-imaging? So the key to answering this question seems to lie in understanding the process as one of symbolical internalization and bodily mapping or encoding. And here I refer to some very interesting work by Gavin Flood. So the idea here is that referential imaging then represents the initial stage of this process, whereas non-imaging represents its culmination. So it's as if by visualizing and holding in the mind a clear image of the perfection symbolized by the deity, and deeply identifying with this luminescent symbol, the visualized image of perfection were to leave a transformative imprint on the practitioner's being. And this is indeed referred to in our texts as the seals of enlightened body, speech, and mind. And these three seals are supposed to transfigure the ordinary perception of physical, auditory, and mental phenomena. And ultimately, through this transformative imprint, it becomes possible to internalize the symbol to such a point that the innate perfection of all phenomena is realized without needing the help of such visualization. And this is precisely the point that Nubchen Sangye Yeshe makes when he compares the use of referential imaging to the process of learning the letters of the alphabet. The initial effort of referential imaging culminates in the effortless mode of non-imaging, just as the difficulty involved in learning the letters of an alphabet, which at first yield only gibberish, allows the student through repeated familiarity to read fluently and seemingly at least effortlessly. So aside from stabilizing the mind, the purpose of referential imaging and of visualization is clearly to effect an actual transformation of the mind, whereby the impure aspects of consciousness are transformed into their pure counterpart, conceptualized as the 5 wisdoms in a process which is compared to alchemical transformation. So this process of internalization is why in classical tantric presentations, the stage that follows the generation phase, during which the deity and its mandala have been constructed, is termed the completion phase, since the process of generation is completed either by dissolving the elements into non-imaging or emptiness, or by focusing on the subtle body and the manipulation of the energies that circulate within it, both of these understandings entailing internalization and dissolution. So what is striking is that when Dzogchen began to emerge as an independent vehicle with the text subsequently, that is post-11th century, classified as belonging to the mind section, 70, and some of these texts may go back as far as the 8th century, but they were codified as a separate set only in the 10th century. So one of the strategies in this process of the emergence of Dzogchen, which was used to distinguish Dzogchen from the surrounding milieu of tantric Mahāyoga, was to radically deconstruct tantric forms of deity yoga, suggesting that Dzogchen's superiority lay in its effortless mode of meditation. In other words, and taking this logic of internalization to its conclusion, if the tantric symbols of perfection could be internalized to reveal an already present perfection or completeness, these symbols could and should be dispensed with altogether, since meditating on them would amount to remaining on the level of an artificial construct, rather than the all-important resting in the unaltered state of intrinsic awareness, the spontaneously perfect nature of mind. So in this way, a contemplative technique such as visualization can serve by its absence as a doxographical indicator of preeminence. Ironically, perhaps, just as visualization of and self-identification with a deity is suggested by some exegetes, notably Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, as being a key distinguishing feature between the classical Paramitayana and the tantric vehicle. So the absence of visualization practice is presented by Nubchen as a crucial element in distinguishing Dzogchen from Mahāyoga and in establishing the superiority of Dzogchen over Mahāyoga. After all, in terms of their philosophical orientation, Mahāyoga and Dzogchen appear, at least on superficial observation, to be fairly similar, since both approaches emphasize non-duality and spontaneously present perfection. Nonetheless, the key difference is that in the Dzogchen context, this is done without having to frame this perfection through frequent references to the deity as a symbol of perfection, the focus being instead directly on the nature of the mind itself. This difference is not only rhetorical, since it reflects a different mode of contemplative practice, one that likewise does away with visualization and referential imaging and consists in repeatedly familiarizing oneself with intrinsic awareness and in stabilizing the process of resting effortlessly and undistractedly therein. In order to emphasize that the perfection which is aimed at by tantric evocation is fully complete in the Dzogchen approach, Nubchen writes that the seal of awakened body, which, as we have seen, highlights the awakened or enlightened aspect of all physical phenomena and signifies the Sambhoga dimension of deities along with their mandalas. He writes then that this seal of awakened body is present as self-originated wisdom without it being necessary to mobilize visualization and referential imaging to realize it. So Nubchen Sangye Yeshe repeatedly refers to Dzogchen as the vehicle without support. This term signifies the support of referential imaging and is used to contrast this type of meditation with that typical of the Mahāyoga approach, which involves the support of more or less complex forms of visualization. In discussing Dzogchen, Nubchen Sangye Yeshe frequently mentions that the principle of this vehicle is without imaging or without referentiality. As mentioned above, given the wide range of meanings associated with mikpa, this signifies that Dzogchen is, ideally in any case, free from what we might call representational thinking, a term that can include visualization, imagination, etc., and that implies imposing a relationship of control on the object so represented. Nubchen vehemently rejects the notion that the realization of the spontaneously present nature of the mind might be achieved relying on pith instructions that make use of referential imaging. And given the force and the repeated nature of this criticism, it seems highly likely that these passages of his work address concerns with contemporaneous alternative presentations of Dzogchen that made use of referential imaging, at least as a preliminary form of practice. Nubchen Sangye Yeshe's basic stance is that there is little point in visualizing the emblems of a deity's body or in identifying the enlightened mind and with it the essence of the deity with a seed syllable such as hung or om, since fundamentally the absolute nature of the mind, the Dharmakaya, is beyond any shape or color. Such tantric procedures merely betray a lack of confidence in the proper view and meditation of Dzogchen, the latter consisting in an effortless mode of resting in intrinsic awareness, whereby intrinsic awareness is, in a sense, identified with the spacious state of mind. I think that's important just to mention. I can't go into the details here. According to this perspective, then, all the practices that involve referential imaging are tied to effort and hence are bound to vitiate and spoil the process of attuning to spontaneously present great completeness. Somewhat paradoxically, despite this uncompromising stance, the tantric elements that are excluded in this attempt to clear doxographical space for an identifiably Dzogchen vehicle are never far from the surface, as is obvious from the fact that they keep being mentioned or invoked in order to be negated. Thus, we can say that visualization, like mantra repetition and the other components of regular tantric sadhana, are a kind of ghost that haunts Dzogchen by its absence. In later, that is 11th to 14th century presentations, such tantric style visionary elements would be, in a sense, reincorporated into the tradition, yet also creatively transformed and adapted to the effortless matrix of the seminal heart literature of the pith instruction session. And later still, the 18th century onwards, overtly tantric visualizations would end up forming an integral part in the contemplative curriculum that frames the practice of Dzogchen. So the purpose of my paper today has been to show how visualization as a meditative technique can also serve a wider doxographical project of demarcating one contemplative tradition from another. In the case that has occupied us here, it's precisely the absence of visualization style practices and the referential imaging that underlies them that is invoked as the reason for the superiority of Dzogchen over Mahāyoga. This is because this absence reflects a form of effortless contemplation that is supposed to be more deeply attuned to the nature of the mind than the mental creation of and identification with deities as images of perfection. Yet at the same time, we've also seen that this absence can be understood as a process of internalizing the symbols of perfection, and indeed makes frequent references to the visualization practices that are negated, thus highlighting once again the dependence of early Dzogchen on its surrounding tantric milieu. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan, for the talk. And so we open the floor for discussion, questions, comments. Yes, okay.
You say a little bit more, thank you, a very interesting talk. Say a little bit more about how it gets brought back in the 11th century and adapted.
Yes, that's a fascinating question. But what happens is that basically the idea is that rather than having visions, rather than visualizing, it's visions that occur. And this is codified then in terms of the practice of tuga, or leap over, where there's a series of 4 different visions that gradually become more and more complex. And these visions are supposed to manifest spontaneously from the heart, which is the seat of intrinsic awareness or the nature of mind. They manifest outwardly then via the channels of that lead to the eyes and into open space. And this practice is done typically with open eyes in front of a spacious landscape, so contemplating the sky, or alternatively in a completely dark room.
Okay, other questions? I know there are 2 people online, but we'll give precedence to people present. First, yes, go ahead.
So I have a question about the step from referentiality to non-referentiality. So the tantric practitioners, they sort of played with the process of signification, basically. They pointed out the arbitrariness of it, and then in somewhat of a game, just manipulated their signified realities, right? And then the Majamaka, they sort of negated this whole thing through like total negations. But here I didn't really understand what this, what was the word you used? This intrinsic awareness is, because this still implies that there's an object. And if the process of internalization is somehow objectless, does this not negate the very process that they're trying to affirm? And I just wondered how that tension was resolved, or was it just a question of saying that this is ineffable?
That's a very good question, very deep one, I must say. But I think that generally, intrinsic awareness is then used, is one of the terms that is used to represent this, the ultimate nature of mind. So another term that is used is bodhicitta. Yet another term is the ground, or also wisdom. And all of these terms are usually used in a way that's supposed to be beyond the subject-object dichotomy. So I would say that once there is a subject and object, then from this perspective, one wouldn't be in intrinsic awareness or in the bodhicitta. But I'm not sure if that quite answers your question.
How is practice? Is it a case of like the thought thinking itself? Is this sort of how it's conceptualized as like a potential state?
The practice involves looking at the mind. So there's, you could say, a self looking at the mind, and without judgment, and without being distracted by the thought processes or sensations, etc., that arise within the mind, and actually considering these thought processes and so on to be the radiance of the mind. So they're not even considered to be anything that's to be rejected, including the passions, etc. So if in the tantric presentations we would have the idea still that there are 5 afflictions, and that these afflictions need to be transformed through such visualization practice into their pure counterpart, which would be then the 5 wisdoms. The idea in the Dzogchen understanding would be that this isn't necessary because there is nothing to transform, because the 5 afflictions are already perfect in and of themselves.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Right. Are you?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
So first, thanks a lot indeed for your very reflective talk. So my question also goes to the same point, the same ground, the referential images and the transformation of the mind. So I was just wondering, what is the stance of Mahāyoga, the transformation of mind? That means the perception of images and the understanding the reality of the mind and the world. It is a fully chemical process of brain, or rather than it is a spiritual translation of the mind. Because in Theravada tradition, I would say there is a crossing bridge between neurological process of brain and the spiritual reflections of the process, because they have to transcend general perception of images and the transferable matters in the objective world. So is it same in the Mahāyoga tradition, or it goes very diversely? I was just wondering.
Thank you very much. I think 2 things I would like to say to that. One is that the process involves the mind, but also the body. I think it goes in the direction of these neurological processes that you were mentioning, that the body is also, as it were, transfigured. And there are long lists of indications that indicate, the successful accomplishment of these practices. And some of these things have a clear physical component, such as the sensation of warmth, or the slowing down of the breath to such an extent that the breath becomes almost imperceptible, or also the sense that the body becomes very light, or that the body requires hardly any nourishment. So there is a physiological component, and then also longevity. Longevity is a very important indication of success. And there is a kind of semantic slippage between longevity and immortality, in a sense. And the other thing I would say about the way in which the Mahāyoga tradition makes use of these images or symbols of perfection, it's not considered arbitrary. So visualizing a chair wouldn't have the same impact as visualizing such a seed syllable and then the Buddha and the mandala, etc., that is constructed from that. And the idea in the Mahāyoga tradition is that these visualizations actually are not just fantasy or make-believe. Of course, there's an element where one pretends to be a Buddha by visualizing oneself or identifying with the image of a Buddha until one has reached that state. But actually, the image of perfection that one is visualizing and holding in the mind corresponds to a deeper level of reality than ordinary perception. That's the way in which this is understood in the Nyingma tantric tradition. And so I suppose where we can say that Dzogchen differs slightly is that in the end, there's no need to mentally create anything because this perfection is already there as it is.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we need to actually give a chance to our online questioners. So Kathy first and then Henry.
Hello, thank you so much, Dylan. As always, really great material. I'm very struck by this presentation by Nubchen, which in some ways his critique of Mahāyoga, I would say, is really, he's kind of misrepresenting Mahāyoga in a way that is rather surprising, considering he was one of the most important early lineage masters of Mahāyoga. But it seems to me that the way that you're presenting it is, as it were, from the Mahāyoga viewpoint, really quite strange. So the notion, for example, of, it being a sort of artificial, creation, and then also the notion that, which of course you then actually, just in what you said to the last question, rather that's taken away because you've pointed out that after all, it's not like that. This is considered to correspond to a deeper level of reality. And then this notion that that in Mahāyoga practice, what you're doing is you're spending all this time, creating something artificially, only to sort of knock it down because you want to get to the completion stage. Well, I would say it's not really like that at all, because it's like generation and completion are two sides of the same coin. And actually, yes, you have the generation first and then you have the completion, but then after the completion, then you have the re-arising. And when you get off your meditation mat, you're actually, everything is manifesting, and that everything in fact is enlightened body, speech and mind everywhere you look. And so from Mahāyoga viewpoint, that it's more the case that the visualizations perhaps for a beginner may be done in a kind of artificial way, but actually it should become effortless. And what you're actually developing is pure vision, to actually see things as they are, which are the manifestation of the mandala, as it were. So and I so for a minute I thought, is this presentation going to have anything in it, in the sense of, you were saying, oh well, later, and I'm sure you were thinking of Longchenpa and so on, but actually, I mean, I think even Zhongzong's quite early commentary on the Jusangwa Ningpo has a very kind of, if you like, a very inner understanding of Mahāyoga. But frankly, I think it's there all along. I think it's there in the the Mahāyoga tantras. Yeah, so that's.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for this, for your remarks. And I think you're absolutely right that, I mean, it is very perplexing what Nubchen Sangye Yeshe was doing when he talks about Mahāyoga, but then I think the same could even be said about the way he talks about Chan. And this is maybe just to do with the nature of doxography, of his project of creating a doxography. When you create a doxography, in a sense, you always misrepresent the traditions that you've placed lower down, because simply by, if nothing else, by virtue of placing them lower in the scale of things, one is misrepresenting them, because each of these traditions would understand itself as a self-sufficient path to enlightenment. And I think, I mean, another thing is we might have had this discussion earlier as well. It's also to do, you know, Nubchen Sangye Yeshe says different things according to, in different texts. And my understanding is that some of these texts were probably compiled when he was younger and with a particular aim in mind. I'm thinking of the Dzogchen text, where he was trying to preserve all the lineages he had received for posterity, almost as is, without too much comment, whereas in his later works, and particularly in the Samkhya Migran, which I think was his masterpiece, he was trying to distinguish Dzogchen from Mahāyoga. And this may be to do with the fact that he was one of those involved in, I wouldn't say creating Dzogchen as a distinct vehicle, because I think they are predecessors, but consolidating it as something very distinct from Mahāyoga. And it's clear that his concern, when he's talking about Dzogchen, he's always referring to Mahāyoga in one way or another. He's always saying, in Dzogchen, we don't need a deity, we don't need a mandala, we don't need a syllable, etc., because all of these things are effortful. So I think it's the fact of associating anything that's visualized with effort. I think for Nubchen, the line of demarcation is really effort versus effortlessness. But you're right to say that from the point of view of an accomplished Mahāyoga practitioner, in the end, that practice is also effortless.
Exactly.
On that note, I think, I'm sorry, but I think we have to stop here because these are very good, juicy questions and comments and responses. And we have to move on to our next presenter. So we'll keep the time, but we can continue this discussion later. There's a discussion session. So